In the summer of 1895, a Philadelphia detective named Frank Geyer was on his knees in the cellar of a rented house in Toronto, digging. He'd been chasing one man across 2 countries for months, following a trail of fake names, forwarding addresses, and unmailed letters a mother had written to her children, letters that were never sent because the man carrying them had no intention of ever delivering them. 3 feet down, the smell told him he'd found what he came for. He would write later that the deeper they dug, the worse it became, until his shovel uncovered the arm of a child. The man he was chasing called himself Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. The newspapers would soon call him something else: the Devil in the White City, the Beast of Chicago, America's first serial killer, and almost everything you think you know about him. The 100-room torture palace, the gas chambers, the 200 victims, is a lie. The truth is worse, because the truth has names. I'm Shane Cohen, and this is Creepy History. He was not born Holmes. He was born Herman Webster Mudgett on the 16th of May, 1861, in the small town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire. The verifiable facts of his childhood are thin, and we should be honest about that from the start, because the Holmes story is a swamp of invention, and a lot of it came from Holmes himself. He was a compulsive liar who later sold his own life story to a newspaper for thousands of dollars. So when he claimed a tortured, abusive childhood, we have to hold it at arm's length. It may have been true. It may have been a salesman shaping a product. With Holmes, that question never goes away. What we do know: he was bright, unusually so. He married his first wife, Clara Lovering, when he was just 17, and soon after enrolled in medical school at the University of Michigan, graduating in 1884. It was there, by most accounts, that the pattern began. To understand it, you have to understand the strange economy of bodies in the 19th century. Medical schools needed cadavers to teach anatomy, and the legal supply was almost always short. That shortage created a black market, a trade in the dead, supplied by men who robbed fresh graves under cover of night and sold what they dug up to whoever would pay. Holmes, the story goes, became fluent in that underworld. He stole bodies from the school's own laboratory, but he wasn't stealing them to study. He was stealing them for something his classmates would never have dreamed of. Here is how the scheme worked. Holmes would take out a life insurance policy on a person, sometimes a real person, sometimes a name he'd invented out of thin air. Then he would acquire a corpse, disfigure it badly enough that no one could say for certain who it had been, and stage the scene so the body appeared to be the insured party, dead in some unfortunate accident. A fire, a fall, a mishap that left a claim and a grieving family, and a payout that went straight into Holmes's pocket. It was elegant in a horrible way. No murder required, just a stolen body, a forged identity, and the cold patience to see the paperwork through. This is the thread to hold on to, because it explains everything that came after. Before there was ever a murder castle, before there was a single confirmed killing, there was the scheme. Insurance fraud. A dead body converted into money. At first, the bodies came from graves. Later, when the supply of conveniently dead strangers ran short and when living people started to know too much, Holmes would simply provide his own. Everything he would become grew out of that one idea. He never really changed his business. He only changed where he got the bodies. He abandoned Clara and their young son. He drifted. And around 1886, he arrived in Chicago, a city that was about to explode into the modern age and a perfect place for a man with a new name and no past. He chose that name carefully: Henry Howard Holmes. Some believe he took Holmes in a nod to Sherlock Holmes, the fictional detective then sweeping the reading public. A private joke, the criminal naming himself after the man who catches criminals. In Chicago's Englewood neighborhood, he took a job at a drugstore, and then took over the drugstore entirely. For years, the story was that he murdered the elderly owner, a Dr. Holton, to seize the business. But here is our first lesson in how the legend lies. Dr. Holton was not an elderly man. Dr. Holton was a woman, Elizabeth Holton, and she and her husband were not murdered at all. They outlived Holmes by years. The story of the poisoned old pharmacist was a myth, and it appears Holmes himself helped spread it. Even in the small details, he preferred a more sinister version of his own life. He was, by every account, charming, magnetic, well-dressed, soft-spoken, with a salesman's gift for making people trust him against their better instincts. One man who worked for him said it plainly. It was the sheer audacity of the fellow that pulled him through. That charm was the real weapon. Not a trapdoor, not a gas pipe. A smile. Across the street from his pharmacy, Holmes began to build. Between roughly 1889 and 1891, he put up a large, 3-story building. The ground floor held shops, the upper floors held apartments, and eventually rooms he claimed would become a hotel. The neighbors gave it a nickname. They called it the Castle. Now, the legend. Brace yourself, because this is the version you've heard, and we're about to take it apart. The story goes that the castle was a purpose-built murder machine. 100 rooms arranged like a maze, hallways that doubled back on themselves, doors that opened onto blank brick walls, staircases leading nowhere, chutes for sliding bodies down to the basement, a kiln or crematorium to burn them, gas pipes feeding into sealed, soundproof rooms so Holmes could asphyxiate his guests at the turn of a valve, and a stretching rack, and an operating table, and a vault where victims were left to suffocate. The story goes that when the Chicago World's Fair opened in 1893, Holmes advertised his building as the World's Fair Hotel, lured travelers inside, and murdered them by the dozens. And you have to understand the scale of that fair to feel the power of the story. The World's Columbian Exposition was one of the largest events the country had ever seen, a gleaming temporary city of white neoclassical buildings nicknamed the White City, built to celebrate progress and human ingenuity. Over its 6-month run, it drew more than 27 million visitors, 27 million strangers pouring into Chicago, many of them alone, many of them unknown to a single soul in the city. For the legend, that was the perfect hunting ground, an ocean of anonymous people who could vanish without anyone noticing for weeks, bodies stripped to skeletons and sold to medical schools, a death toll of 100, 200 souls. It is one of the great horror stories in American history. The shining white city of the future, and beneath its shadow, a castle of death. And almost none of it is true. Let's go through it. The 200 victims? Historians who have spent years in the actual records, people like Adam Seltzer, who went through period newspapers and court documents line by line, can confirm around 9 killings with any real confidence. The figure of 200 appears to trace back to a pulp book published in 1940, decades after Holmes was dead. One historian called the 200 number a throwaway line with no basis in fact. The labyrinth of trapdoors and gas chambers? When Chicago police and reporters finally went through the building in 1895, the sensational architecture mostly wasn't there. The yellow press, the tabloid newspapers of the era, invented the torture chambers wholesale. The genuinely strange features of the building, the odd hidden spaces, had a far more mundane explanation. Holmes was buying furniture and goods on credit, and hiding them from the creditors who came to repossess. The secret rooms weren't for bodies, they were for stolen sofas. On one occasion, a furniture company's workers arrived to seize their property and found the building empty. Holmes had walled the goods up in a single room. The World's Fair Hotel packed with murdered tourists? The 3rd-floor hotel was never actually finished, never furnished, never opened to the public. It was a scheme to swindle suppliers and investors, not a trap. And of all of Holmes's likely victims, only one is known to have been a World's Fair tourist. During the period when the legend says he was prowling the fairgrounds harvesting visitors, Holmes was, for much of it, several states away. So why does the myth exist at all? 2 reasons, and they're the dark heart of this episode. The first is the newspapers. This was the golden, poisonous age of yellow journalism. The great press barons, William Randolph Hearst chief among them, were locked in a brutal circulation war, and the rules of that war were simple. The most shocking stories sold the most papers, and the truth was an obstacle, not a requirement. Reporters routinely embellished, invented, and dramatized, A lurid crime was money in the bank, and Holmes was the perfect raw material. In 1895, one paper ran an article titled "The Castle of a Modern Bluebeard," Bluebeard being the folktale villain who murders his wives and hides their bodies in a forbidden room. The article came complete with detailed floor plans of the building, rooms helpfully labeled with names like torture chamber and hanging secret room. None of it was verified, much of it was simply drawn, but it was a sensation. It was reprinted in papers across the country, and with each reprinting the building grew more elaborate, the body count climbed higher, the trapdoors multiplied. The papers liked Holmes so much as a villain that they did something extraordinary. They paid him. One of them handed over a sum reported as high as $7,500, an enormous amount in the 1890s, for the rights to his written confession. Think about what that means. A newspaper paid a serial killer to tell the most sensational possible version of his own crimes. They weren't reporting on a monster, they were commissioning one, and Holmes was happy to deliver the product they'd ordered. The second reason is Holmes himself. He loved it. A man who'd spent his whole life inventing more sinister versions of his own story was handed a national stage and a checkbook. So he confessed. He confessed to 27 murders, except several of the people he confessed to killing were alive. One of them, a woman named Kate Durkee, was living in Omaha and had to put out a public statement saying, and you can hear her exasperation across 130 years, that she had never been murdered by Holmes or by anyone else. That is the strange truth of the murder castle. The building was real. The horror attached to it was, to a stunning degree, a collaboration between a killer who wanted to seem larger than life and an industry that profited from making him so. But strip all the invention away, and you are not left with nothing. You are left with the bodies that were real. And those are the part of the story the legend almost buried. Here is what the trapdoor stories cost us. By turning Holmes into a cartoon, the newspapers erased the actual people he killed. They had names. They deserved them. Holmes's method was almost never a maze. It was intimacy. He got close to people, usually people with money or an insurance policy or knowledge of his crimes, and then they vanished. There was Julia Connor, the wife of a man who worked at Holmes's jewelry counter. The whole family had moved into Holmes's orbit. That was how he worked, drawing people close, making himself indispensable. Holmes began an affair with Julia. He drew her into his business schemes, made her a part of his world, and for a while she may have believed she had a future with him. She and her little daughter, Pearl, who was 6 years old, disappeared around Christmas of 1891. Holmes gave different stories at different times, at one point claiming Julia died during an abortion he performed, an explanation that conveniently made her death an accident rather than a murder. The truth of what happened to her, and to a 6-year-old child, has never been established. They were there, and then they were not. And the man who'd loved Julia simply moved on to the next scheme. There was Emmeline Sagrand, a bright young woman who came to work for him as a stenographer, drawn in like the others. They were the sisters Minnie and Nanny Williams. Minnie had both a romantic and a financial entanglement with Holmes, and she had something he wanted, property and money. Then both sisters were gone. After the building was searched, detectives found 2 theatrical trunks with Minnie's initials painted over, as if someone had tried to erase her. And among Holmes's possessions was a photograph of Emmeline, discovered only because her father, still searching for his missing daughter, wrote from Indiana asking about a picture of her that had surfaced. Imagine that, a father, months or years on, still writing letters, still hoping, finally being told that his daughter's photograph had turned up in a dead man's effects. These were not strangers pulled off a fairground. They were people who had let Holmes into their lives, who trusted him, worked for him, loved him. And that trust was the trap. There was no machinery. It was just a charming man and a private decision that another human being was now worth more dead. The killings the evidence supports most strongly, though, the ones that finally caught him, were not in Chicago at all, and they began with a partner. Benjamin Peitzel was Holmes's longtime accomplice, a fellow con man in on the frauds. and in 1894 the two of them cooked up their biggest insurance scheme yet. Peitzel would take out a large life insurance policy, then fake his own death, and they'd split the payout. A substitute body would stand in for the corpse, but Holmes didn't use a substitute body. He killed Benjamin Peitzel for real. The man who trusted him most, the partner who thought they were running a con together. Holmes murdered him and collected the insurance on a death that was supposed to be staged. And then he did something that is hard to find a word for. Peitzel left a widow, Carrie, and 5 children. Holmes went to Carrie. He told her that her husband was alive, in hiding, waiting for the heat to die down, waiting to reunite the family. And he offered to take 3 of the children, Alice, 15, Nellie, 11, and Howard, 8, to be reunited with their father. For months, Holmes moved them across the country, Carrie in one group, the 3 children in another, his own new wife in a third, checking them into hotels under false names, sometimes keeping the mother and her children just streets apart in the same city, never letting them meet. One writer described it as a game. Holmes possessed them all, and he savored the possession. The children wrote letters home. Holmes collected the letters, promised to mail them, and kept them in his trunk. Then, one by one, he killed them. He murdered the 2 girls, Alice and Nellie, in that rented house in Toronto, and buried them in the cellar. He killed the boy, Howard, in a cottage outside Indianapolis. We'll leave the details where they belong, in the record. It is enough to say that an 8-year-old boy went with a man he'd been told would take him to his father, and never came back. That is the real Holmes. Not a haunted house. A man who could look a grieving mother in the eye, take her children by the hand, and lead them out of the world, while carrying their unsent letters in his luggage. The man who unraveled it was the one from our cold open, Detective Frank Geyer of the Philadelphia Police. Holmes's spree had ended, at first, almost by accident. He was arrested in Boston in November 1894, not for murder, but for the insurance fraud, tracked there by Pinkerton agents. Authorities thought they had a gifted swindler. They had no idea what was underneath. But the Peitzel children were missing, and Geyer could not let it go. In the summer of 1895, he set out to do something painstaking and unglamorous. He retraced Holmes's entire winding path across the Midwest and into Canada, and it is worth sitting with how hard that actually was. This was an era before computers, before shared databases, before a photograph could be transmitted in an instant. Geyer had a stack of pictures of the children, a rough sense of the cities Holmes had passed through, and his own 2 feet. So he went city by city, hotel by hotel, boarding house by boarding house. He would arrive in a town, walk into lodging after lodging, and show the same photographs and ask the same questions. Had anyone seen this man, these children, traveling under any name? Holmes had checked them in under aliases, scattering false identities deliberately to make exactly this kind of trail impossible to follow. Geyer was, in effect, trying to reconstruct the movements of a man who had spent months ensuring he could never be reconstructed. His one great advantage was a stack of paper. Holmes, for reasons no one has ever fully explained, had kept the children's unsent letters, the ones they'd written home to their mother, the ones he'd promised to mail and never did. Those letters mentioned places, details, small clues about where the children had been and when. A detective could read them like a map drawn by the victims themselves. The trail led to Toronto. And there, in Toronto, the breakthrough came the way real breakthroughs so often do, from a small, ordinary conversation. A chance remark from a city clerk pointed Geyer toward a particular rented house on Vincent Street. He went to the neighbors. One of them remembered the tenant clearly, remembered specifically an odd thing. The man had borrowed a spade and had never explained what he wanted it for. Within the hour, Geyer and the Toronto police were in the cellar of that house, digging. And 3 feet down, in the dark and the smell, he found Alice and Nellie. He did not stop there. The same relentless method, the same retracing of a killer's footsteps, led him onward to a rented cottage near Indianapolis, in a neighborhood called Irvington. There, the remains of young Howard were recovered. Investigators learned that during his time in that cottage, Holmes had visited a local pharmacy and a shop where blades were sharpened. The boy's remains were found in the home's chimney. When the discoveries hit the newspapers, the investigation finally turned back to Chicago, to the castle, and detectives went through it, searching for the horrors the headlines were already promising. What they actually found was quieter and, in its way, more damning than any gas chamber. A trail of dried blood, a clot mixed with human hair, a child's blood-stained undergarment, a rope knotted and dark with blood. Not a theme park of death. Evidence of specific, real killings, the kind that leave a mother without her children. There was one cruel irony in the chase. Holmes, sitting in prison, was allowed to read the daily papers, so when the news broke that the children's bodies had been found, he read it before investigators could confront him with it, and immediately invented a new story. A mysterious man named Edward Hatch had done it, he said, a man who, conveniently, looked almost exactly like Holmes. No one believed him. Holmes was tried in Philadelphia in the autumn of 1895, but for only one murder, Benjamin Peitzel's. This is one of the most haunting legal footnotes of the case. Detective Geyer had assembled the devastating evidence about the children, but the judge ruled it largely irrelevant to the Peitzel trial. Guilt in one murder, he held, is not proof of guilt in another, even when the victims are a single family, even when they are clearly part of one scheme. So Holmes was never tried for Alice, for Nellie, for Howard. Officially, in the eyes of the law, he hanged for their father alone. The jury convicted him quickly. He was sentenced to death. In his final months, the showman never fully stopped performing. He sold the newspaper Confession with its 27 imaginary murders. He embraced Catholicism near the end. He maintained, observers said, a remarkable calm. On the 7th of May, 1896, Herman Webster Mudgett, Dr. H. H. Holmes, was hanged at Moyamensing Prison. He was 34 years old. On the scaffold, in his last words, he took it all back. He insisted he was guilty of almost nothing and challenged the watching crowd to go and find Benjamin Peitzel's real killer. He had one last request, and it tells you everything about a man who spent his life robbing graves. He asked to be buried 10 feet deep in a coffin filled with cement, so that no one could ever steal his body the way he had stolen so many others. For more than a century afterward, rumors swirled that he had somehow cheated the rope and escaped, the legend refusing to let him die. In 2017, at the request of his own descendants, his grave was finally opened. The remains were there. Dental records confirmed it. The devil in the White City was, at last, just a dead man in concrete. And the castle? It burned not long after his arrest, set alight by someone whose identity was never established. The site was rebuilt and, for decades, served as an ordinary post office. People bought stamps where the legend said monsters once walked. Which leaves us with the real horror of H. H. Holmes. And it isn't the trapdoors. It's that we needed them. The true story. A charming man who killed the people who trusted him, who took 3 children from their mother with a smile and a lie, was somehow not enough. So the newspapers built him a haunted house and gave him 200 faceless victims. And in doing so, they almost erased the few real ones we can actually name. Julia, Pearl, Emmeline, Minnie, Nanny, Benjamin, Alice, Nellie, Howard. Remember them. Not the castle. The castle was a story. If this one got under your skin, you can help us by subscribing. It's the single biggest thing that lets this channel keep digging up the true versions of stories everyone thinks they already know.